The wind blew cold across the battlements of Winterfell. Though the snows had receded with the coming of spring, the sky remained gray, a perpetual curtain of cloud that muted the afternoon sun. Robb Stark stood upon the highest parapet, gazing over the courtyard where men trained with swords and spears. He still wore the mantle of the king in the north, a thick fur cloak clasped over his shoulders, though his hair had grown a shade darker since the days of his first rebellion. The cause that had spurred him into war had turned the best part of him to steel, a sense of loss tempered into resolve. And yet, there was a glimmer in his eyes that had not been there for many moons. The news from across the narrow sea was astounding, and he could not help but marvel at how the fates wove their threads. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to greet his mother, Catelyn Stark. She was thinner than she had been, worry etched permanently into the lines around her mouth. The tragedies that had befallen the Starks, the loss of Ned, the exile of Arya, the separation of the family, had aged her in ways heartbreak always does. But she carried herself with dignity. Tully pride manifested in every step. She offered Robb the barest hint of a smile. They say she comes from the sea with 3 dragons, a queen calling herself Daenerys Stormborn. Some name her the Mother of Dragons. Others name her usurper of the usurper's line. Rumor from the east travels quickly, Robb replied, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb the soldiers below. I was uncertain whether to believe the first whispers. Now it seems her legend has grown too large to dismiss. She has sacked cities in Slaver's Bay, freed thousands from bondage, and at last word, she had turned her gaze toward Westeros. Catelyn's brow furrowed. You speak as though you know her. I only know what the ravens carry, mother, he said. Yet the lords who fled King's Landing speak of a Targaryen. They say she reclaims the throne of her ancestors. While the Lannisters tear at each other and the Tyrells posture with sweet words, she hovers across the sea with an army. Now there comes a message, one addressed to the king in the north. A flicker of surprise crossed Catelyn's face. She writes to you? Robb nodded. A raven arrived last night. She desires an alliance, or so she says. She commands dragons, an army of unsullied, freedmen, and Dothraki screamers. She needs the north. She needs our recognition, our support, if she is to march on the Iron Throne with the realm's acceptance. Catelyn exhaled and turned her gaze down to where several soldiers sparred in pairs. Their wooden shields clapped with dull echoes. We've lost so many already, Robb. If this Targaryen queen comes to conquer, how do we stand against dragons? If she offers to treat with us, it might be wise to listen. Robb's eyes flickered with a tired but resolute light. The terms she offers would unite our forces. She calls on the old history. Aegon the Conqueror took the 7 kingdoms with his dragons, but he only did so by forging alliances as well as by conquest. She suggests a marriage to seal our trust. A marriage? He released a slow breath. Yes, me. A union of Targaryen and Stark. She claims it will unify the realm, cement the North's independence or at least its autonomy under a new Targaryen reign. She promises that if I bend the knee, I shall remain Warden of the North and keep our ancient traditions. She even promises us justice against the Lannisters. Catelyn let her gaze linger on her son. Though her maternal instincts wished to shield him from all the ways the realm might devour him, she knew too well the political realities. Once, Robb's betrothal to a Frey had cost him dearly when he'd broken it. That betrayal had set them on a course to ruin. Though they had survived the Red Wedding in this reimagined fate, by the narrowest margin and with the help of devoted Northmen, they had lost many allies, had sown distrust, and the scars still lingered. You have a wife, Catelyn said carefully, recalling Talisa. Gone now, though the memory was fresh and raw. Or you had one before the phrase took her life. The North remembers, and so do I. Forgive me for speaking of such a painful subject. Robb closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a breath that carried years of sorrow. I have not forgotten Talisa, he said softly, nor will I ever. But I am still the king in the North, and my people need to survive. They need hope. If forging an alliance with a Targaryen queen, if wedding her, brings peace and prosperity to the north, then I must consider it. Catelyn took a moment to absorb the gravity of this new development. The personal cost was high, but the realm was in dire straits, and the living demanded their leaders make sacrifices. The memory of Ned's sense of duty flickered in her mind. Ned had wed her for an alliance, and though love had followed, it was a union arranged to bridge the Tullis and the Starks. And Ned had lived an honorable life, bound to the love that had grown from such an arrangement. "When does she come?" she asked. "She has already arrived in the north, farther south, near White Harbor, from what the ravens say. She landed with her entourage, accompanied by Ser Jorah Mormont, a few Dothraki blood riders, and a small host of Unsullied. The majority of her forces remain on ships anchored close by. She wants to come to Winterfell in peace." He paused. "I told her she would be safe here." Catelyn nodded, though she was quietly alarmed. The idea of dragons in Winterfell was as much a wonder as a threat. And if she decides to take what she wants by force? Robb's gaze drifted past the walls. "I do not think that is her intention. The time for subterfuge is over. She needs allies to hold the lands she conquers. And if she truly can bring dragons to our cause, perhaps all the horrors that have befallen us might end before another generation is torn apart." They stood in silence for a moment longer. Then Catelyn reached for her son's arm. "We'll welcome her as a guest, and we shall see what sort of woman wishes to call herself our queen." They had prepared Winterfell's great hall for a royal guest. Fires burned in the massive hearths, casting flickering light across the high stone walls. Winterfell was ancient, its corridors and towers steeped in the heritage of House Stark. The hush among the household as they awaited Daenerys Targaryen's entrance only emphasized how strange the moment was. Here, in the far north, the Targaryen sigil had not flown in centuries, not since Aegon Targaryen had demanded the submission of Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt so many generations ago. Robb stood at the center of the hall, Grey Wind at his side. The dire wolf, immense and silent, regarded the outer door with watchful golden eyes. Lords and retainers from across the north were present, those who had remained loyal to Robb even after the disasters of war. Men with lined faces and bitter hearts, wives and daughters who had lost husbands, fathers and sons, all waiting to see if this Targaryen queen would be the next plague upon them or the beginning of a fragile new hope. The doors opened to admit a swirl of chilly air and the glow of daylight behind a small group of visitors. There were the Unsullied, warriors clad in distinctive armor with tall spears, their expressions unyielding. There were the Dothraki, hair bound in long braids, curved rocks at their hips. At the center stood a young woman with silver gold hair, braided intricately around her head. Her complexion was fair, her posture queenly. A mantle of pale fur ringed her shoulders, a concession to the north's climate. Her violet eyes swept over the great hall, taking in the Stark banners, the Watchers, the Lords. Then she stepped forward. She was smaller than Robb had expected, though hardly fragile. There was a coiled strength in the way she held her spine, in the measured poise of her gaze. She approached him without fear, her posture regal, her chin lifted. He took a step forward, offering a slight incline of his head. "Welcome to Winterfell, Daenerys Targaryen." She studied him for a moment, as though taking the full measure of the man. "Thank you for receiving me, Robb Stark, King in the North." At his side, Catelyn stood. Her face, though polite, was guarded. Many had claimed titles throughout the war. Still, to see a Targaryen style herself as queen on Westerosi soil was not an everyday sight. Lord Roose Bolton, once a traitor but having narrowly regained a semblance of favor by saving Robb in the darkest hour of the Red Wedding fiasco, stood off to the side, expression unreadable. The Manderleys were present too, keeping watch from near the dais. "I hear you've traveled far," Robb said, voice echoing in the hush. "Would you care to warm yourself by our fires?" She gave him a small, formal smile. "I would. These northern winds bite harder than the sea storms I've sailed through. Perhaps we can talk about the terms of our alliance." There, in the heart of Winterfell, before the watchful eyes of the north, Daenerys Targaryen and Robb Stark walked side by side, their retinues trailing behind. Wine was poured, introductions were exchanged. The tension in the room was palpable, for the North was proud and suspicious, and Daenerys had long grown used to betrayal and subterfuge. But as they spoke, a fragile sense of possibility unfurled. The two young leaders had seen too much war, too much death. Perhaps that gave them common ground. At length, amid talk of White Walkers rumored beyond the wall and the ongoing chaos in King's Landing, they came to what truly mattered: unity. "You propose a marriage," Robb said, his tone carefully controlled, "to forge an alliance between the North and the Targaryen claim. I would be your consort, and the North would join your cause against any who oppose the rightful queen." Daenerys nodded. She glanced around, letting her gaze settle on Catelyn for a moment. "I know what the Lannisters have done to you. They took your father's head. They put your sisters in danger. They destroyed your family's unity. It mirrors the pain I've suffered as the last Targaryen when I was alone in the world. But I do not seek revenge alone. I seek to break the wheel that crushes the innocent. And for that, I need allies who will stand with me. I have dragons, two now, as one was lost in an attack across the sea, enough to inspire fear. But fear alone will not rule the Seven Kingdoms, and I will not use it to force the North to kneel. I want to be queen of a united realm, not a tyrant lording it over cinders." Her voice carried conviction, echoing through the hall. Robb studied her as she spoke. There was no mistaking the passion behind her words. There was an earnestness in her that reminded him, heartbreakingly, of himself in the early days of his rebellion, when he believed wholeheartedly in justice. "You say you do not wish to be a tyrant," he replied, "and yet your forebear Aegon conquered these lands with fire and blood. How do I know you are different?" Daenerys raised her chin. "Because I have freed slaves rather than chained them. Because I have taken cities not to rule them with cruelty, but to allow them to shape their own destinies once the yoke of oppression is lifted. I have made mistakes, some of them grave, but I have tried to learn from them. I ask for your faith, King in the North. In return, I will give you mine. Let us rule side by side, each respecting the other's dominion. The North will remain under House Stark's protection, free to uphold its traditions, while still being part of the Seven Kingdoms that I hope to unite. Our marriage will symbolize that bond." Silence lingered in the hall. Faces turned to Robb, waiting for his answer. He breathed slowly, the weight of his father's memory and his responsibilities pressing upon him. Gray wind nudged his hand, a quiet show of support. At last, Robb spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. "I accept." A ripple of murmurs spread among the watchers. Some bristled at the thought of bending the knee to a Targaryen, even symbolically. Others breathed relief that at last, they might see the final end to a war that had taken everything from them. Daenerys inclined her head regally, a spark in her violet eyes. "Then let our union seal a new era for the North and for all the realm." In that moment, no one truly knew what the future would hold. Yet, hope stirred in hearts long drowned in despair. The king in the North and the mother of dragons would wed beneath the ancient weirwood of the godswood. It felt like something out of the old legends, where ice and fire met in the circle of life and forged something new. The next few weeks were a swirl of preparations. Winterfell's staff bustled day and night, cleaning and decorating halls that had stood dormant for so long in war's aftermath. The Manderleys shipped in fresh provisions from White Harbor. Boltons, Umbers, Glovers, and other lords of the North made their way to Winterfell to witness this historic alliance. Some came willingly, others reluctantly, but all recognized the significance. Daenerys, for her part, spent her days learning the customs of the North. She walked the courtyard, speaking with soldiers, listening to the stories of men who had fought in bitter cold for their king. She visited the crypts where the old kings in the North lay, learning the weight of House Stark's lineage. She even ventured to the great library that Maester Luwin had left behind, poring over tomes that told of the last time dragons soared above Westeros. Through it all, she carried herself with quiet confidence, accompanied often by Missandei, her closest counselor, and Ser Jorah Mormont, who found himself both uneasy and comforted by returning to the north, the land of his birth. Robb spent as much time as he could with her, discussing matters of governance. He was pleasantly surprised by her sharp mind, her willingness to debate, and the empathy with which she considered the plight of small folk. There was a part of him that remained guarded, as if a deeper trust could not be granted so easily. But there was also something in Daenerys, an echo of that sense of duty and justice he had once cherished in himself. Each day that echo grew louder. In the Godswood, beneath the watchful eyes of the Heart Tree, they held a small private ceremony a week before the official wedding day. The old gods, silent as the wind through the red leaves, bore witness. Arya Stark had not been found, but Sansa was rumored to be held somewhere in the Vale. Bran and Rickon were gone, believed dead for a time, but then rumored alive in the distant north, though confirmation was lacking. It fell to Catelyn to stand as Robb's nearest kin. She pinned a single wolf's head clasp to Daenerys' cloak before the Heart Tree, and Daenerys placed a silver ring carved with dragons' heads upon Robb's finger. The ring had been crafted in the forges of Meereen and carried a faint swirling pattern reminiscent of scaled wings. For that quiet moment, the entire realm seemed to hold its breath. Later, in the solar, Robb and Daenerys sat by the fire, a modest supper spread between them. He studied the flames, remembering how as a boy he'd stared in wonder at the crackling hearth in the great keep. "I never thought to wed again," he said at length. "There was a time when I thought, once a man marries for love, there can be no other." Daenerys regarded him with gentleness. "Love can blossom more than once. Sometimes it is not the same kind of love, nor does it come as swiftly, but that doesn't mean it will never come. My marriage to Khal Drogo was one of fate and necessity, but in time we found something real. His death hurt me more than I ever imagined. But each chapter of our lives shapes us into who we become. Perhaps in forging a future for the North and for my birthright, we can find solace in each other's companionship. If not love, then respect and maybe one day more." He reached for her hand, small and warm, as if containing a hidden fire. "I hope so," he said simply. The sparks from the hearth danced in the air, and the swirl of smoke and warmth felt oddly comforting, as though the old ghosts of Winterfell approved. Word spread quickly through the realm. The king in the north was to wed the mother of dragons. Reactions varied. In King's Landing, where Queen Cersei Lannister held tenuous power, the news sparked fear and anger. She raged at her council, who trembled at the thought of dragons allied with the north. The Tyrells watched the developments with caution, uncertain whether to make overtures or hold their ground. Meanwhile, on the Iron Islands, Euron Greyjoy sneered at the idea of yet another coalition that might hamper his own ambitions, plotting raids on unsuspecting coasts. Only time would tell if the other powers of Westeros would fall into line or rise up against this new threat. But in Winterfell, the wedding day dawned cold and bright. The sun broke through gray clouds for the first time in weeks, igniting the fresh snow that dusted the courtyard into brilliant crystals. Trumpets sounded from the walls at midday. Lords and ladies gathered in the courtyard, pressing close in their cloaks. Long tables had been set up laden with hot mulled wine and steaming soups, enough to keep the chill at bay. Daenerys wore a gown that combined Essosi and Westerosi styles. The bodice was of shimmering pale blue, embroidered with the crest of House Targaryen in silver thread, while a cloak of white fur draped from her shoulders to brush the ground. Her hair was plaited in multiple braids, echoing a touch of Dothraki tradition, yet pinned in a half-spiral that gave a regal nod to Westerosi queens. At her throat hung a delicate silver chain, from which dangled a small pendant shaped like a dragon's tooth. Missandei walked behind her, carrying a trailing portion of the train, her expression proud for her queen. Robb wore his house's colors, a tunic of gray wool, trimmed in white fur, over dark breeches. The king in the North's crown, wrought of bronze and iron in a simple circle, rested upon his head. He met Daenerys at the center of the courtyard, beneath an archway of woven pine boughs, flanked by weirwood branches that had been brought in for the occasion. The hush of anticipation was broken only by the snap of banners in the breeze. A Septon had traveled from White Harbor to perform the ceremony according to the faith of the Seven, though the presence of the heart tree's branches was meant to honor the old gods as well. The Septon's voice carried, solemn and strong. We gather here to witness a union of houses long parted by war and time. We gather here that the king in the north and Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen might be joined in marriage, forging a new alliance that we hope will bring peace and unity to the realm. There were few who missed the symbolism of ice and fire meeting in that snowy courtyard. Even those who were uneasy could not deny the stirring emotion in the air. As the Septon continued, Daenerys's gaze locked with Robb's. She recalled the desert heat of the Red Waste, the chaotic crowds of Slaver's Bay, the uncertain storms at sea. He remembered the privations of the Northern Wars, the heartbreak at the Twins, and the vengeance he had sought. Now, in this moment, they stood upon a precipice of something new. "I do solemnly swear," Robb said, his voice steady, "by the old gods and the new, to stand beside you, Daenerys Targaryen, in times of peace and times of war, to honor our alliance, to guard your life with mine, and to defend our united cause against all threats." She held his hands, feeling the calluses that spoke of battles fought. "I, Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, swear by all the gods, old and new, that I shall stand beside you, Robb Stark, as your wife and ally. I vow to protect the North as my own people, to hold them in my heart as I hold my birthright, and to offer you my trust as I ask for yours." The Septon nodded. The hush deepened. "Then I proclaim you man and wife. May your bond be as unbreakable as the fierce north wind, and as enduring as dragon's flame." A roar of celebration went up from the crowd. Horns sounded, banners waved, and a flurry of activity burst through the courtyard. Some onlookers cheered out of earnest hope, others with more cautious expressions. Yet all recognized that a transformative moment had just occurred in Winterfell's ancient courtyard. Daenerys Targaryen and Robb Stark were wed. That evening, a grand feast took place in the Great Hall. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, venison, trout, and hearty northern fare. Flagon after flagon of ale and spiced wine was poured. Musicians played a mix of mournful northern airs and lively Dornish tunes. Despite the lingering tension among certain lords, the atmosphere was largely one of guarded optimism. The North had endured so much suffering that any chance at respite felt worthy of celebration. Daenerys, seated beside Robb at the high table, partook in conversation with Northmen who rarely traveled beyond the Winterfell region. She spoke kindly to them of her experiences in Essos, painting pictures of the exotic cities. They listened, fascinated yet cautious, for many had never left Westeros, nor dreamed of doing so. Ser Jorah Mormont, newly returned to his ancestral land, found himself welcomed by some kin who recalled his father, Jeor Mormont, the old bear of the Night's Watch. But there were some who looked upon him as a disgraced exile. The tension was palpable, though overshadowed by the magnitude of the event. For Robb, the feast brought a swirl of emotions. He remembered how once he had dreamed of a future with Talisa by his side. Now he sat here, married again, forging a new destiny for himself and the North. A part of him felt guilty, as though betraying Talisa's memory. Another part recognized that this path might ensure the survival of all he held dear. As the hour grew late, he and Daenerys exchanged glances that suggested they were both overwhelmed by the moment's significance. Catelyn watched them from the side, her heart heavy with conflicting feelings. She was proud of Robb for rising to meet the challenge of leadership. She saw in Daenerys the steel of a woman who had fought for every scrap of power and respect she had gained. She prayed silently to both the old gods and the new that this alliance would not unravel as so many had before. Amid the revelry, Grey Wind prowled under the table, occasionally resting his massive head on Robb's thigh. Daenerys observed the dire wolf with curiosity. "He truly is a symbol of your house," she remarked softly. Robb nodded, stroking Grey Wind's thick fur. "He's more than that. He's been my companion since he was a pup. In battle, he fought by my side. He's saved my life more than once." Daenerys regarded the creature with wonder. "He is formidable indeed. I suspect he would not care for a dragon's presence, though. A wry half-smile touched Robb's lips. Perhaps in time, they could learn to tolerate each other. Wouldn't that be a sight to behold? She mused. Their brief exchange signaled a new sort of closeness, if not intimacy. They were bound now by oath and crown. The hall wore on into late hours. Tales were told of Stark ancestors, of Targaryen conquests, of knights from every corner of the realm. Eventually, the bride and groom took their leave, departing to their chambers amid a throng of onlookers who cheered and raised cups to their future. The early weeks of their marriage were spent in a flurry of political maneuvering. Daenerys dispatched ravens to the lords of the Trident and the Vale, calling for them to recognize her claim and ally with the North. Robb's bannermen worked to reassure Northerners that this Southern queen would not strip them of their independence. Letters poured in from across the realm, some offering cautious support, others dripping with veiled threats. When at last they found quiet moments alone, Robb and Daenerys discovered a shared resilience beneath their outward forms. They were leaders forged by loss, sharpened by necessity. Often, after council meetings, they would retreat to the Godswood or the library. Daenerys walked beneath the red leaves of the Heart Tree, marveling at the face carved there, feeling the ancient weight of the place. Robb, for his part, grew curious about her experiences in Essos, the battles she had waged with dragons at her side. She told him of Drogon, the mightiest of her three, who was still at large, flying free over the seas. It was said that one day she might call him to her again, but only if she truly needed him. At night, sometimes they would talk in hushed tones about the White Walkers rumored to be gathering beyond the wall. Daenerys had heard strange tales from Melisandre, from the Free Folk, from her own brief glimpses of prophecy. Robb knew the North's legends, ominous tales of the Long Night and the Night King. They spoke of the possibility that the real war was not for the Iron Throne, but for survival against a threat older than the Targaryen dynasty. Their marriage bed was a careful space, one they navigated with quiet respect. Passion did not spark immediately, for both carried scars, both possessed caution. But tenderness grew, and on some nights, they held each other against the chill, letting the warmth of shared hopes and fears stave off solitude. A fortnight after the wedding, word reached Winterfell that a Lannister host was moving north from the Riverlands, possibly to test the new alliance. Scouts reported that Jaime Lannister led a contingent of knights, bolstered by sellswords. The rumor was that Cersei had demanded a swift and brutal blow against the Starks and Targaryens before they gained further strength. Alarm spread among Robb's council. "What is their aim?" demanded Lord Greatjon Umber, slamming a fist on the table. "To come and burn our fields, or to test our mettle in open battle?" Robb glanced at Daenerys, who had joined the war council in a long-familiar black and red cloak. "We have the advantage of the northern terrain. They will suffer in unfamiliar territory if they march now. But we cannot underestimate their cunning. Jaime Lannister is no fool. He must know we're prepared." Daenerys's voice rang clear. "Let them come. We will show them what northern resilience and Targaryen fire can accomplish. While my dragons are not all here, Rhaegal remains within flight distance. If need be, I can call upon him." A ripple of excitement and apprehension stirred in the lords. The presence of even one dragon could change the tide of war. Robb exchanged a meaningful look with Daenerys. They both understood that unleashing a dragon in the north could be fraught with danger, friendly casualties, the risk of the beast turning uncontrollable. But if Jaime Lannister thought he could roll over their combined forces, the advantage was theirs. "We shall gather our armies," Robb declared. "We'll not let the Lannisters lay siege to our lands unopposed." Daenerys nodded in agreement. "And I shall prepare Rhaegal if it comes to that. I would prefer to minimize bloodshed, but if the Lannisters press us, we'll show them no mercy." Scouts soon reported that the Lannisters had indeed pushed north, crossing the neck with cunning speed, bolstered by some smaller lords who had refused to heed the summons of the king in the north. Yet, the reality of the northern terrain proved punishing. Spring in the north was still cold, and the roads were muddy from melting snow. Jaime's forces slowed, vexed by hidden pitfalls and the scarcity of provisions. Robb, anticipating this, sent small raiding parties to harass them, attacking at night and vanishing into the fog. Tensions ran high, but a large-scale confrontation had yet to occur. Within Winterfell's walls, the new queen prepared. Daenerys stood in the courtyard under the morning sun, wearing riding leathers reinforced with mail. Rhaegal's immense shape loomed behind her, the dragon's wings half-furled, his emerald scales glinting in the pale light. The Northmen watched in a combination of awe and trepidation. Even Grey Wind kept a wary distance, hackles raised. Daenerys ran a hand along Rhaegal's flank, murmuring calming words in High Valyrian. The creature snorted, jets of smoke curling from his nostrils. Robb approached, and for a moment, the dragon growled low in its throat. But Daenerys soothed him with a short command. Rhaegal's eyes, slitted like a cat's, fixed upon Robb, then flicked away in disinterest. "I don't think he likes me," Robb murmured wryly. She tilted her head. "He's learning. Dragons are not mindless beasts, but they can be temperamental. In time, he may come to accept your presence. For now, he listens to me because he knows me. We have flown together, fought together." Robb gazed at Rhaegal's massive wings, imagining what it must be like to ride above the clouds. "I'll trust your judgment, my queen. If it comes to battle, we'll use every advantage we have." He hesitated, then lightly touched her arm. "Just be safe." She smiled, a brief flicker of warmth. "Dragons are dangerous, but so is the queen who rides them. You keep yourself safe as well, King in the North." He inclined his head, then turned to see to the mustering of troops. Armored men gathered in the courtyard, preparing to march. Horses stamped restlessly, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold air. The banners of House Stark and House Targaryen fluttered side by side, one of gray and white with the direwolf, the other black and red with the three-headed dragon. The sight was unprecedented, a sign to all who saw it that times had changed irreparably. On the outskirts of a small village north of Moat Cailin, the armies met at last. Jaime Lannister had positioned his knights cleverly, using what patches of dry land he could find to form lines of defense. Robb's forces circled them, using the bogs and thick woods to their advantage, cutting off retreat routes. Torches flickered in the dusk as the two sides prepared for battle. Mounted on a sturdy northern stallion, Robb surveyed the field. Daenerys, astride Rhaegal at a safe remove, watched from above, scanning for signs of the Lannister cavalry's deployment. The tension was a tangible thing, each side waiting for the other to make a move. When the horns sounded, the violence erupted. The Lannisters charged with their cavalry, hoping to break the Stark lines. But the Northmen met them with pikes, forming an unyielding shield wall. Horses screamed, men shouted, steel clashed. In the swirling melee, the fortunes of war teetered uncertainly. Robb, wielding his sword with practiced skill, led his men from the front, Grey Wind bounding at his side, sowing terror among the enemy. The direwolf's enormous jaws and savage leaps felled more than one knight. Overhead, Rhaegal screeched, a clarion call that shook the air. On Daenerys' command, the dragon swooped low. His jaws opened, and from his throat poured a torrent of emerald flame, scorching a line of Lannister pikemen who had massed to flank the North's archers. The spectacle of dragonfire lit the sky, painting the battlefield in a hellish glow. The scent of burning wood and flesh filled the air. Men who had never faced a dragon broke rank, fleeing in terror. Some, to their credit, tried to rally. Jaime Lannister fought with grim determination at the center of his forces, silver hand glinting amid the carnage. He bellowed orders, trying to keep his men together. Spotting Robb, he spurred his horse forward, determined to cut a path to the king in the north. Their swords met in a ringing clash. Robb felt the power of Jaime's strikes. He was indeed as skilled as the tales claimed. Blow after blow, they traded, steel singing in the chaos. Grey Wind snarled, but was forced to fend off Lannister soldiers who tried to surround his master. Flames erupted again from above. Rhaegal swept down, unleashing another gout of fire that blasted a siege engine. The screams of men being burned alive mingled with the roar of the inferno. Daenerys guided the dragon with skill, though she spared a thought for the devastation she wrought, the painful reminder of how quickly men could die beneath a dragon's wrath. Jaime's horse stumbled, unseated by the confusion around them. He crashed to the ground and rolled, coming to his feet with surprising agility. Robb closed in, sword raised. Jaime parried, face taut, golden hair plastered to his brow with sweat and blood. In that moment, a swirl of flame seared across the battlefield, forcing Robb to throw up an arm to shield his face from the heat. When he looked again, Jaime was gone, lost amid retreating Lannisters. Their lines had collapsed under the combined might of the Northern Army and Dragonfire. They were in full retreat, many discarding shields and weapons as they fled. Robb let out a ragged breath, scanning for further threats. The battlefield was chaos, bodies strewn across muddy ground, wounded men crying out for aid. But the Lannisters were broken. Daenerys landed regal in a wide clearing. The dragon's tail lashed, smashing a cart to splinters. A hush fell over the surviving Lannisters nearby, who stared at the beast with wide, horrified eyes. Robb approached, raising a hand in greeting. She slid down from the saddle, removing her riding gloves, her face streaked with soot. "It's done," she said breathlessly. Robb replied, voice strained. "Their forces are routed. We've won." His gaze shifted to the men lying about in their death throes. He sheathed his sword, grim with the knowledge of what victory had cost. "We'll see to our wounded first. Then we'll show mercy to any surviving enemies who surrender." She gave him a nod of agreement. "I am queen of all, even those who once opposed me. Show them justice, and they may yet bend the knee." In the aftermath, the combined Stark or Targaryen forces took stock of their position. Many Lannisters had been captured, including some lesser knights and bannermen. Jaime himself had escaped, rumored to be fleeing south with a small band of survivors. Robb dispatched riders to track them, but the dense terrain made pursuit difficult. The immediate threat was contained, and the North rejoiced at this decisive victory. Yet, for Daenerys and Robb, the euphoria of triumph was mixed with a deeper reckoning. They had used dragonfire on Westerosi soil. They had won, but the sight of charred corpses and fields scorched to ash weighed on them. Daenerys knew that to many, she would be seen not as a liberator but as a bringer of destruction. Robb understood that the memory of dragonfire in the north might sow both awe and fear among his people for generations. Still, the politics of war were never simple. They had to stand firm, or risk being consumed by the relentless game that was Westeros. When they returned to Winterfell, a subdued celebration greeted them. Survivors praised the queen who had turned the tide with her dragon, and the king who had fought like a true wolf of the north. Yet, the memory of war's horrors clung to their halls, like the scent of smoke in the rafters. Late that night, Daenerys stood in the courtyard, gazing at the starless sky. The day's victory felt hollow in her chest, haunted by the ghosts of those burned. She had always known dragons were both a blessing and a curse, a double-edged sword that gave her power but demanded a heavy moral toll. The swirl of snow around her made the night feel timeless. She sensed Robb's approach before she saw him. He stepped beside her, still in part of his armor, the fur mantle draped about his shoulders. "You should rest," he said gently. She gave a soft laugh, a weary sound. "I will, but my thoughts won't let me. Each time I close my eyes, I see the fire. I hear them scream. I know we had to do it to protect what we have, but still." Robb turned to regard her, his blue eyes reflecting sympathy. "I know. Men died by my sword today as well. War spares few from guilt." They stood in silence for a time, the distant hush of the wind the only sound. Then, hesitantly, he placed a hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him, allowing his warmth to seep through her. "We will forge a better realm," she whispered, almost to herself. "We must, or else all this is for nothing." He nodded, pressing his forehead against hers briefly. "We will, together." Their shared resolve glowed in that quiet moment, a spark of humanity amid the grim reality of war. Bound by oath and crowned by adversity, the king in the north and the mother of dragons had chosen each other. It was an alliance built on practicality, but tempered now by empathy, trust, and a stirring sense of something more. In the weeks that followed, the news of the Stark Targaryen victory spread. Many lords sent envoys to Winterfell, eager to gauge the new power dynamic. Some offered fealty, while others maneuvered politically. The Vale, under the guidance of Peter Baelish and the nominal leadership of young Lord Robert Arryn, remained aloof, though there were rumors that Sansa Stark might resurface under the Vale's protection. The Riverlands, still scarred by the War of the Five Kings, hovered in a precarious neutrality, though many smaller houses cheered the downfall of the Lannisters. In the midst of this shifting political landscape, Robb and Daenerys took a personal step. They traveled to the Wall, accompanied by a retinue of trusted guards. Word had come from the Night's Watch that strange sightings persisted beyond the ice. The wildlings, now more integrated with the Watch after the events of the previous year, spoke of mysterious figures moving in the far north, bringing with them an unnatural cold. Daenerys flew part of the way on Regal, while Robb and a portion of their retinue rode. It took days, the terrain growing starker and colder with each league. At last, they reached Castle Black, a grim fortress perched at the edge of the known world. Jon Snow was there, newly elected as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He wore the black cloak and the old sword Longclaw at his hip. While the official histories might label him a Stark bastard, his quiet bearing and dark, brooding eyes nonetheless carried the imprint of Ned Stark's legacy. He greeted Robb warmly, though with the distance demanded by his vows. When Daenerys arrived, dismounting from Regal in the courtyard, the brothers of the Watch stared in awe and fear. Jon approached her with measured caution. "Your Grace," he said, dipping his head. "Welcome to the Wall." She nodded. "Lord Commander Snow, I've heard much of you." Jon glanced at Robb, who gave him a subtle, reassuring nod. "I serve the Night's Watch now. The realm's politics are behind me," Jon said simply. Daenerys's gaze flicked across the bleak stone walls of Castle Black. "And yet, you must see what is happening beyond the wall. The White Walkers, the dead that walk, that is not mere politics." Jon led them to a chamber warmed by a small fire. There, over cups of steaming mulled wine, they spoke of the threat that loomed. The rumors of ancient evil, the glimpses of unnaturally pale figures, the corpses that rose to attack. Robb listened intently, remembering how his father had always taught him that Winter was to be respected and feared. Daenerys considered it with solemn thought, recalling the glimpses of prophecy she had heard from the Red Priestess and others in Essos. "So you believe they are real?" Daenerys asked, leaning forward. Jon's eyes were steady. "I've seen them with my own eyes. We've fought whites beyond the wall. If we do not unite against this threat, there will be no realm left to fight over." A chill that had nothing to do with the climate settled over the room. Robb exhaled, running a hand through his auburn hair. "Then we must prepare. But how? The living war tears the realm apart. No one believes in an army of the dead until they see it themselves." Jon spread his hands. "The Night's Watch does what it can to hold them at bay. But we need allies. We need the rest of Westeros to realize that this war is the only one that truly matters." Daenerys's voice took on a quiet intensity. "Then they shall. If the realm unites behind our banners, we can rally them to the wall. My dragons can help, but even dragons may not suffice if this threat is as dire as you say. We'll need every sword, every spear. If the Lannisters continue to attack from the south, we'll be torn in two directions." Jon nodded gravely. "Convincing them is another matter. Most lords will scoff, believing it a northern fable. But perhaps a Targaryen queen and a Stark king allied might sway them." Robb stood, his conviction visibly firming. "We have no choice. We must do all we can. For the North, for the realm, for every living soul in Westeros." It was a sobering conclusion, yet one that bound them together. They spent more days at Castle Black, overseeing the meager resources of the Night's Watch, speaking with wildling representatives who remained beyond the wall. Daenerys flew regal along the edge of the icy barrier, glimpsing the vast white expanse that stretched northward. She felt the primal power of the cold, an eerie hush that seemed to whisper of ancient horrors stirring in the dark. One night, Daenerys and Robb stood atop the wall itself, looking out over that endless frozen wilderness. The sky was clear, revealing a tapestry of stars. Beneath that starry canopy, they spoke quietly, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Sometimes I wonder," Daenerys said, voice low, "if everything I did in Essos was just preparation for this. Not just for the Iron Throne, but for something far greater, the battle for life itself." Robb's gaze lingered on her profile, illuminated faintly by torchlight. "My father once said we must protect the realms of men. I always thought that meant keeping out the wildlings or punishing Lannister treachery. But this is bigger than any war of thrones. Perhaps we're all pieces in a larger puzzle." She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Will the realm follow us when the time comes, Robb? Will they heed our call? Or will they carry on their petty wars until the dead are at their door?" His mouth pressed into a grim line. "We have to try. We've gained allies. We've shown our strength. And we have reason to believe that once the realm sees the threat for themselves, they'll come to our side." Daenerys drew closer, reaching for his hand in the cold. "Then together we shall do it. We've won battles. We've bled and lost and endured. If this is the path we must tread, I will walk it with you." Her hand was warm despite the chill, and Robb squeezed it gently. In the hush of the wall, where the wind seemed to whisper of ancient prophecies and the inexorable approach of winter, they solidified their partnership not just for thrones and crowns, but for the living world itself. When they returned to Winterfell, life was anything but calm. Envoys from Dorne arrived, bringing cautious respect and a hint of southern disinterest in northern affairs. A Tyrell messenger came bearing a marriage proposal for one of the lesser Tyrell daughters to a Stark cousin, a sign that the powerful Reach House might be hedging its bets. From the west, a letter arrived from the Iron Islands, containing a mocking invitation for Daenerys to treat with Euron Greyjoy, who claimed he could offer her the greatest fleet in Westeros if she would only ally with him. The letter's tone hinted at madness and arrogance. Robb and Daenerys weighed each offer, each entreaty, each threat. They had to move carefully. It was not enough to simply sit in Winterfell and wait. If the White Walkers were truly on the march, they had to rally the realm, or at least secure enough stability to head north when the time came. The daily grind of rulership wore on them both. Robb found in Daenerys a partner who could see possibilities beyond the narrow lens of the north, someone who was both pragmatic and idealistic. Daenerys, in turn, relied on Robb's steady command of his people and the loyalty he inspired among them. And in quieter moments, they discovered small comforts in each other. Shared meals where they spoke of anything but war, or stolen hours in which they rode through the winter woods, gray wind loping beside them, the hush of the forest offering fleeting peace. Rumors spread of a child, for in Westeros, whenever a king and queen wed, talk of heirs follows swiftly. Though no one knew the truth, the small folk whispered that a dragonwolf babe would be born, uniting ice and fire in flesh. Some said it was a sign of a new era. Others muttered darkly that any child of Targaryen blood might unleash horrors upon the land. As the sun sank low on a day that felt more autumn than spring, Robb found Daenerys in the castle's small godswood garden, separate from the main grove. She stood gazing at a frozen pond, wearing a heavy cloak over her gown. He approached softly, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots giving him away. "You're quiet," he said gently. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "Thinking of what is to come, of what we've done, and what we still must do." He nodded, stepping beside her. The reflection of the sky in the pond, half frozen, rippled when a stray wind passed. "You have regrets?" She exhaled. "I wish the path to peace did not require so much war. I wish I could have met you under different circumstances. If our houses had not been torn apart centuries ago by dragons and rebellion. But I cannot change the past. his gaze fixed on her, solemn and kind. "We forged the future. That's all we can do. And you won the hearts of many of my people. They see the way you carry yourself, not as a conqueror, but as someone who genuinely cares." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "You've won mine as well." She looked at him, the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes quickly replaced by warmth. Their hands found each other in the hush of the godswood. A light snow began to fall, flecking their cloaks. The moment felt suspended in time, a respite from the world's cruelty. "We will stand against what comes," Daenerys whispered, "and we'll do it together, king and queen, wolf and dragon." Robb pulled her close, pressing his brow to hers. He could feel her breath against his lips, the softness of her hair brushing his cheek. "Aye, together." In that quiet glade, with winter's gentle flakes drifting around them, their alliance of necessity moved another step closer to genuine affection, perhaps even love. They had begun as strangers bound by crowns and vendettas, but in forging a path for the North and the Targaryen throne, they discovered a connection deeper than politics or war. Whether that fragile bond would weather the storms and horrors yet to come remained to be seen. But for that moment, at least, they found solace in each other's presence. Two weary souls from distant corners of the world, holding on to hope in the face of winter's unrelenting chill. Alas, there was little time to dwell in tender moments. The realm called them to action once more. Raven after raven arrived with fresh tidings, the Lannisters regrouping around Harrenhal, the Tyrells sending uneasy feelers northward, the Greyjoys threatening the western coasts. The shape of the war was changing, as alliances shifted and new threats emerged. And behind it all, the ominous rumor of an undead host beyond the wall grew. In the solar, Robb and Daenerys pored over a map of Westeros. Their voices were low yet urgent. Advisors crowded around them, among them Catelyn Stark, Ser Jorah Mormont, Lord Bolton, and Lord Manderly. "We cannot be everywhere at once," Robb said, the edge of frustration creeping into his voice. "We must secure the North from Ironborn raids, but we can't leave the southern approach vulnerable to a Lannister incursion." Daenerys traced the coastline on the map with a slender finger. "If we can convince the Tyrells or the Dornish to join us, we could box the Lannisters in. That might free us to turn our attention to the wall when the time comes." Lord Bolton's measured tone broke in. "Dorne has always disliked the Lannisters. They might be persuaded, given the right incentive. Marriage alliances, trade agreements, titles." Catelyn pursed her lips. "But Dorne also has a long memory of Targaryen involvement. They might be wary of another Targaryen rule." Daenerys sighed. "Then we will show them we are not our ancestors. I'll send envoys to Prince Doran Martell. Meanwhile, we must remain vigilant here." Robb nodded. "Agreed. I'll keep enough men to defend the North against any stray attacks. The rest we can muster for a push south, if it comes to that." They laid out the broader plan. Hold the neck with a strong garrison, ensure White Harbor was fortified against Greyjoy raids, send a diplomatic delegation to Dorne, and maintain open lines of communication with the Vale. The meeting lasted for hours, each detail dissected. By its end, the tension in the room was thick, but a direction had been set. As the council adjourned, Daenerys lingered at the map, her fingertips on the painted table's depiction of the wall. The memory of that cold frontier clung to her thoughts. A quiet voice near her ear made her turn. It was Catelyn Stark. "My lady," Catelyn said gently, "I see your worry. It is a concern we all share. The dead beyond the wall, whether it is a small threat or the end of the world, we must be prepared." Daenerys regarded Catelyn, seeing the lines of sorrow that carved her face. "We must unite this land, or we have no hope of standing against them." Catelyn nodded. Ned believed that too. He always said the Stark words, "Winter is coming," were more than a motto. It's a warning. Daenerys felt a surge of resolve. Winter has come, but so have the dragons. We will not let the darkness prevail. Despite the unrelenting pressures, there were moments of light. One evening, a small celebration was held in the Great Hall to honor the victories and the new alliances forming. Musicians plucked at strings, and jesters performed modest feats. The mood was subdued but hopeful. Robb and Daenerys sat at the high table, not in the formal manner of their wedding feast, but more relaxed, occasionally speaking quietly as they observed their guests. Halfway through the night, a hush fell as a group of wildling representatives stepped into the hall. They had been sent by Jon Snow to discuss amnesty and integration below the wall. They were wary and suspicious, dressed in patched furs, their hair and beards wild. Many Northmen eyed them with distrust, for the memory of wildling raids was not easily forgotten. Yet, Daenerys rose from her seat, inviting them to partake in the meal. Some lords grumbled, but Robb added his approval, and the tension eased enough for cautious conversation to flow. A wildling woman with a scar over her brow approached Daenerys. "I hear you ride a dragon," she said bluntly. "That's some magic power. Might be good against the dead if they come." Daenerys studied her, seeing a hard life etched in her features, the same hardness she had often seen in the freed slaves of Essos. "We'll need more than dragons," Daenerys replied gently. "We need every sword willing to fight. Will you stand with us?" The woman gave a shrug. "We'll stand with any who value our lives. We've lost enough to the cold. If you and the Crow King up at the wall say you'll let us live in peace, we'll fight." In that moment, Daenerys found a spark of hope. Enemies who had once been separated by walls of prejudice could come together in the face of a greater threat. The news spread that the wildlings might serve as a first line of defense, and while many northern lords grumbled, few could deny the benefit of having more blades when the dead marched. As time pressed on, Daenerys and Robb's marriage began to settle into a genuine partnership. They found moments of closeness amid the swirl of responsibilities. They shared laughter over modest jokes, relived old memories, discovered small cultural quirks that made the other smile. It was not the whirlwind passion of a fable, but something real and unspoken grew between them. A bond of respect, admiration, and slowly kindling affection. One afternoon, Daenerys joined Robb in Winterfell's courtyard as he sparred with some of his soldiers. The ring of steel on steel resonated in the crisp air. Grey Wind lounged nearby, head on his paws. Daenerys watched, arms folded around a cloak, a slight smile on her lips. She appreciated how Robb moved with grace and skill, his expression focused yet calm. When he finally stood at rest, he wiped sweat from his brow and turned to her, a lopsided grin forming. "Come to judge my form?" he teased. She tilted her head. "Only to observe, though I suspect I could match you if I trained as often as you do." He walked over, passing his sword to a nearby soldier. "Perhaps you'd like to try?" She lifted an eyebrow. "You would mock me?" "Never," he said earnestly. "I only offer if you wish to learn. Or spar. I know you're quite capable in other forms of combat, dragon riding among them. But with a sword." Daenerys considered it, then nodded. "Very well." They took wooden practice swords, stepping into the ring. A few onlookers paused in their tasks to watch the queen spar with the king. Robb adopted a guarded stance, waiting for her move. Daenerys struck first, tentative but with a quickness born of agile reflexes. Robb parried easily, though with gentle contact, not wanting to overpower her. She frowned, determined, and attacked again, this time feinting left and swinging right. Robb blocked, shifting to circle around her. They danced in the yard, exchanging blows that tapped wood on wood. Daenerys's breath quickened, but she refused to yield. Robb, for his part, felt a surge of admiration at her ferocity. Finally, when her arms trembled from the unfamiliar strain, he caught her blade mid-swing and gently twisted, disarming her with a fluid motion. The wooden sword clattered to the ground. Daenerys breathed hard, but her eyes sparkled with adrenaline. "You're good," she panted. Robb smirked, setting his sword aside. "So are you. With proper training, you'd best half the men in my army." She smiled, a flush coloring her cheeks. "Perhaps I'll take you up on that." A small crowd clapped at the friendly display. Daenerys bent down to pick up the wooden sword, then let Robb guide her from the ring. They were both a little winded, laughing softly. In that moment, their partnership felt effortless. The responsibilities of war and politics faded, if only for a fleeting instant. But war, like winter, never truly sleeps. Another raven arrived that night, bearing dire news from the Riverlands. The Lannisters, reinforced by new sellsword companies, had seized Riverrun. Edmure Tully was besieged, his men outnumbered. The Lannisters sought to draw Robb south into open battle. If Riverrun fell, the Riverlands would effectively belong to the Lannisters once more, pressing an attack path northward. Robb's fists clenched as he read the letter. Tensions mounted in the War Council. Some urged a swift strike south to relieve the siege. Others advised caution, wary of a trap. Daenerys leaned over the table, her expression stern. "We can't ignore this," she said. "If the Lannisters secure Riverrun, they can cut off our supply lines to the south. The Riverlands are key to our entire strategy." Catelyn's voice trembled with concern. "Riverrun is my family's seat. My brother is there. We cannot leave him to die." Lord Bolton's tone was measured. "Marching south so soon would stretch our forces thin, especially with the possibility of Ironborn raids in the west. And if we lose a major confrontation with the Lannisters, it could shatter our alliance's momentum." Robb rubbed his temple, deep in thought. "Edmure has enough provisions to hold out for a time, but the Lannisters might be trying to bait us. We must not walk into another red wedding." A hush fell at that reference. They all remembered the near catastrophe of the twins. Daenerys placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "We must be strategic. Use the mobility we have, regal to scout, cavalry to harass. Make them regret setting foot in the Riverlands." Robb nodded, his mind ticking through the possibilities. "We'll plan a campaign that keeps them pinned. We can't let Riverrun fall." Thus, the course was set. Forces would move south under Robb's command, while Daenerys would coordinate from a forward position near Moat Cailin, ready to deploy dragonfire if necessary. The old fortress at Moat Cailin would serve as a staging ground. They would attempt to encircle the Lannisters, cutting off supply lines from the Westerlands. And so the next chapter of their conflict began. Armies marched from Winterfell, banners snapping in the chill wind. Daenerys took flight on Regal, the dragon's dark silhouette passing over the neck, a harbinger of fire and fury. At Moat Cailin, she set up a command post, Ser Jorah at her side, Missandei managing the logistics, Dothraki scouts patrolling the swamps. The air was thick with tension, like the static before a thunderstorm. Robb and his generals advanced along the King's Road, splitting off detachments to flank the Lannister positions. Day by day, the tension mounted, letters flying back and forth as they coordinated movements. Word reached them that Jaime Lannister was not at Riverrun. Rather, it was Ser Gregor Clegane, the Mountain, who commanded the siege. The thought of that brute leading the assault made many a soldier blanch. The Mountain's reputation for cruelty and bloodlust was legendary, but they had to press on. Each sunset brought them closer to the confrontation that would decide the fate of the Riverlands. Scouts returned with news of the Lannisters' fortifications, describing earthen ramparts and catapults, mercenary camps bristling with foreign swords. It would not be an easy siege to break. Night fell on the camps, men huddled around fires, sharing tales of home. Daenerys paced inside her tent at Moat Cailin, restless. She received a raven from Robb describing a plan to lure the Lannisters away from Riverrun by feigning a push from the east. If it worked, they could catch them between two Stark, Targaryen forces and crush them against the castle walls. But it required precise timing and risked heavy losses. She set the letter aside, exhaling sharply. Outside, Regal curled around a ruined tower, dark scales blending with the night. Occasionally, he let out a soft rumble, smoke drifting from his nostrils. Daenerys ran a hand over her face, exhaustion tugging at her. She missed Robb's steady presence, missed the sense of partnership in every decision. But they both had parts to play. "I must not falter," she murmured to herself. She was a queen forg, ning in every direction, trampling each other in their desperation to escape the dragon's wrath. She pulled back on the harness, signaling Regal to hover momentarily. Another volley of crossbow bolts hissed past. One struck his side at an angle that deflected off a scale, rattling away. "Careful," Daenerys hissed through clenched teeth, patting his shoulder. She knew that if a scorpion bolt found a weak spot, it could prove deadly even to a dragon. She scanned the chaos, searching for any larger war engine that might be a threat. Her eyes locked on a stout siege tower that had been modified with scorpion mounts near the top. Several men clustered around it, desperately trying to aim. Daenerys urged Rhaegal forward. He roared, unleashing more fire. The siege tower's top erupted in sparks, then collapsed in a blazing heap. The scorpion toppled, the men manning it flailing in vain before plummeting to their deaths. With that, the immediate threat from the western side seemed broken. She spotted swirling pockets of Lannister knights trying to regroup, but the Dothraki pressed them hard. The unsullied shield wall advanced inexorably, spears thrusting with deadly precision. She risked a glance further south. The tide of battle was churning across every visible approach to Riverrun. In the distance, near the eastern horizon, the banners of House Bolton and House Karstark fluttered, the feint that had drawn away so many Lannisters in the first place. The plan was working. The ring of the siege was fractured, the once ordered lines now a half-destroyed patchwork of flame, broken palisades, and panicked men. Exultation flared in Daenerys' chest, but only for a moment. War was never so simple. From the corner of her eye, she saw a cluster of Lannister men break into a charge, heading toward a large supply wagon loaded with barrels. Instinct seized her. Those barrels might hold black powder or something equally explosive. She steered Rhaegal in their direction. But as she approached, her mind racing with possibilities, the men tipped one of the barrels and then fled. A bright flash and a booming roar rocked the field. The wagon erupted in a violent spray of fire and shrapnel. Shards of wood and metal pelted Rhaegal's flank, causing the dragon to shriek in pain. Daenerys was nearly thrown from the saddle. She clung desperately to the harness, the sting of splinters lancing her cheek. Dazed, she blinked away the spots dancing in her vision. Rhaegal flapped madly, ascending to escape the brunt of the explosion's aftershock. Below, she saw the wagon's wreckage spitting flames and smoke. Several Lannister soldiers had been caught in the blast, lying unmoving in the mud. "Steady," she rasped, stroking Rhaegal's neck. He roared again, and raged, spitting a burst of flame at random. Another tent caught fire. Daenerys coaxed him higher, pushing through the rising fumes. Her heart thundered. Had that blast been luck or a planned trap for the dragon? She could not be sure, but either way, it reminded her that every step in this war carried mortal risk. At ground level, the Dothraki pressed on, heedless of the explosion. She heard their battle cries, blood-curdling whoops and shrieks that promised no quarter. The Lannisters, faced with Dothraki speed and unsparing brutality, were giving ground. Some knights tried to rally, shouting for the realm, for House Lannister, for Casterly Rock. Others threw down their swords, surrendering or fleeing the field entirely. Ahead, the massive portcullis leading into Riverrun groaned, then lifted. Tully soldiers spilled out to join the fray. Their morale soared at the sight of the dragon's flames and the battered Lannister lines. Daenerys watched them, feeling a surge of satisfaction. If they secured the castle's perimeter from the inside, it was over for the besiegers. Gregor Clegane's noose around Riverrun would be cut in half. Yet, Clegane himself was nowhere to be seen, and something told Daenerys that a man like him would not retreat so easily. Dismissing the thought momentarily, she brought Rhaegal into another pass, unleashing a final barrage of dragonfire upon a cluster of Lannister supply tents. The flames roared, and with it, the last vestiges of organized defense around the castle's western face seemed to collapse. White banners in the shape of improvised rags began to appear here and there. The screams and clangs of steel receded, replaced by the crackle of burning timbers and the groans of the wounded. Atop Riverrun's battlements, Daenerys glimpsed Tully archers who waved a battered sigil, House Tully's trout, stained with smoke. Then, from a small sally port near the gate, a slight man with auburn hair stumbled out, leaning on a retainer. It had to be Edmure Tully, though he looked gaunt and pale from the weeks of siege. Daenerys guided Regal to land in a relatively open patch near the moat, carefully avoiding the bodies and debris. The thunderous beat of the dragon's wings kicked up dust and ash. When she slid from the saddle, her legs ached from exertion, and her arm throbbed where the arrow had grazed her. But the adrenaline pumping through her veins pushed the pain aside. Ser Jorah, spattered with mud and blood not his own, hurried to her side with a contingent of Unsullied. "Your Grace," he said, kneeling briefly. "The field is ours, though scattered pockets of resistance remain. We'll see them dealt with." She inclined her head, scanning the courtyard. "Where is Lord Edmure?" "Over there." Ser Jorah pointed to a knot of Tully soldiers who ringed their lord protectively as he approached. Daenerys moved forward, and the Tully men parted. Edmure Tully looked thinner than she remembered from the stories, with weary eyes and a trembling stance. Still, he managed a shaky smile when he realized who she was. He sank into an awkward bow. "Your Grace," he said, voice hoarse. "We, Riverrun, owes you our lives. The siege was strangling us. We had scant days of food left." Daenerys nodded solemnly, offering her hand. "Rise, Lord Tully. You fought bravely to hold your lands. My husband, Robb Stark, regrets that he could not be here for this. He has drawn away many Lannister troops elsewhere, so we might break your chains." Edmure straightened, staggering a little. One of his guards supported him. He managed a grim smile. "Then I am twice indebted to you both. The realm will speak of the day the Mother of Dragons came to Riverrun's rescue." Daenerys accepted his gratitude with a measured nod, already thinking of the next steps. "We must secure the castle, aid the wounded, and push any remaining Lannisters out of the Riverlands. Then we must link up with Robb's forces, wherever they've led the Mountain's men. We cannot let them regroup." A wave of Tully men hurried past, cheering raggedly as they saw the dragon up close. An awe-inspiring sight, if also terrifying. Daenerys's Unsullied formed ranks around the wounded, lending calm efficiency to the chaos of victory. Dothraki scouts galloped to the river to ensure no Lannister survivors were hiding amid the rushes. Smoke drifted in heavy clouds over the broken siege lines, the stench of burned flesh mingling with the tang of blood and muck. Ser Jorah placed a hand on Daenerys' shoulder. "We should find a place to rest, Your Grace. You've done more than enough for one day. Let me see to your injuries." She gave him a faint, weary smile. "Yes, I'll see a maester if Riverrun still has one. But first, we must confirm that this area is truly secured." Already, her vision swam with exhaustion, yet she forced herself to remain composed. A queen did not show weakness. A queen must lead until the realm was safe. Within hours, the immediate threat was contained. A few Lannister stragglers and mercenaries were taken prisoner, some still stumbling in shock from dragonfire. Others fought to the last or fled into the surrounding countryside. The Tully garrison worked alongside Unsullied to douse the worst of the flames, while the Dothraki prowled the perimeter, rounding up frightened horses and searching for plunder. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, replaced by the grim work of counting the dead. Daenerys found herself in Riverrun's Grand Hall by late afternoon, seated on a carved wooden chair that Lord Edmure had offered for her comfort. Torches burned in sconces along the walls, casting flickering light on the Tully tapestries and the once proud banners that had seen better days. The Maester of Riverrun, an older man named Vyman, carefully cleaned her arm wound, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. "This is but a scratch," he said, "though it must be cleansed well to avoid infection." The arrow was none too clean. Daenerys winced at the sting of the salve. "Thank you, Maester." She looked past him to see Ser Jorah conferring with a few Tully knights near the hall's entry. "When you've finished, will you see to the wounded among my men? We left our own Maester behind in Winterfell." Vyman nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. The courtesy you've shown Riverrun today shall not be forgotten." She inclined her head. Had her mind not been so heavy with the burdens ahead, she might have allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. But victory in one battle did not end a war. and she still had no word from Robb. A coil of worry twisted in her stomach as she considered what might happen if the mountain turned on him in force. The plan had been to lure a portion of the Lannisters east, but cunning can turn to calamity if the enemy was better prepared than expected. "Have you any ravens to send word to the king in the north?" she asked. "Yes, your grace." Maester Vyman finished bandaging her arm, then directed a younger acolyte to gather parchment. "We can send a message immediately. Tell him Riverrun is liberated," Daenerys said, standing up, "and that we await word of his own situation. Urge him to be cautious. Gregor Clegane is not to be underestimated." Vyman bowed and hurried off, while Daenerys took a few steps, flexing her stiff limbs. She glanced around the hall, taking note of the carved fish symbols that adorned the stone pillars. Riverrun was older than many southern castles, a seat of a proud family. What had once been a comfortable fortress had been battered by siege. She saw cracks in the walls, scorch marks in corners, and the haggard faces of Tully retainers who offered stiff bows as she passed. War had come here often in these last few years. Tired as she was, duty did not permit her to rest fully. She stepped outside to the central courtyard, where dusk settled with a gentle hush. The Riverlands air felt marginally warmer than the true north, but it still carried a chill. Edmure Tully was there, supervising the distribution of the last of Riverrun's meager stores to the hungry survivors. She offered to help however she could, promising that her forces would share what supplies they had. The men and women of the castle looked upon her with curiosity, fear, and gratitude all at once. None had ever expected a Targaryen, let alone one on Dragonback, to be their savior. "There will be more battles ahead," she quietly told Edmure. "We must gather strength. Can Riverrun hold if the Lannisters return in greater numbers?" Edmure grimaced. "We'll hold for as long as we can. The walls remain strong, and if you and your husband are near, then the Lannisters may think twice. But Gregor Clegane is a monster. If he returns with a larger host, I fear the cost." She understood too well. Yet the alternative was to press forward, to chase the Lannisters into retreat, or to meet them on the open field once and for all if that was Robb's plan. She thought of King's Landing, where Cersei might be raving at the news of another Targaryen victory. A part of Daenerys burned to push all the way to the capital, to tear down the Red Keep and claim the Iron Throne. But that dream, which had guided her for so long, was now tangled in more urgent realities. Forging alliances, defeating the Lannisters in detail, and preparing for the threat in the far north. If only Westeros had the sense to unite, she thought bitterly, so many lives could be spared. Night fell fully, and torches were lit along Riverrun's walls. Daenerys made a final tour of the perimeter, speaking to the men on watch, ensuring that the new lines of defense were established. Rhaegal dozed by the moat, occasionally lifting his head to snort and shift position. He was sated, blood and battle always left him stirred but exhausted. She scratched his scales gently, murmuring words of thanks and praise. Without him, the battle might have dragged on for days. When she finally retired to a small guest chamber, battered by the siege but hastily cleaned, exhaustion hit her like a tidal wave. She sank onto the bed, half wondering if Robb was safe. She closed her eyes and dreamed of a hallway lined with direwolf sigils and Targaryen dragons, twisting together in an unending tapestry. Morning dawned, gray and drizzling. Daenerys woke to the rasp of swords sharpening in the courtyard. Outside her window, she saw the men stirring back to life, the wounded carefully tended by the maester's staff, the survivors patrolling the muddy banks of the castle moat. Rhaegal, perched on a partially collapsed tower, spread his wings to catch the faint light. For a moment, she simply watched him, marveling at the improbable reality that she had brought dragons back into this world. Her reverie was broken by a brisk knock on the door. Missandei entered, her face drawn with concern. She had traveled from Moat Cailin as part of the follow-up wave once the battlefield had been declared secure. "Your Grace," Missandei said, bowing her head. "A raven arrived early this morning from Lord Stark. I thought you would want to read it immediately." Daenerys accepted the rolled parchment and broke the wax seal, scanning the words. Her eyes flicked across the page, lips tightening. Missandei stood quietly, waiting. He has engaged a large contingent of Lannister forces, including Gregor Clegane. The battle is ongoing near the Red Fork, but it seems the feint turned into a pitched fight. She lowered the parchment. He writes that his men have the advantage, yet the mountain's forces are savage, and the outcome remains uncertain. He's calling for reinforcements if we can spare them. Missandei's brow creased with sympathy. They drew away the Lannisters as planned, but perhaps more came than expected. Daenerys folded the parchment, her mind racing. We must ride out at once. Riverrun is secured enough to hold. Lord Edmure can manage the rest. Robb needs the hammer blow of our combined might to finish this. If we allow the Lannisters to slip away and regroup, we'll face another siege or worse. She moved to the chamber's small table, where a basin of water waited. Splashing her face, she spoke over her shoulder. Gather the Dothraki blood riders, half the Unsullied. The rest can stay to help fortify Riverrun. I'll speak to Edmure about leaving a portion of his men here in defense. Then we ride and fly. The king in the north shall not stand alone. Missandei inclined her head. At once, your grace. Daenerys dried her face, ignoring the stab of pain in her bandaged arm. She considered the scrapes and bruises she'd earned from the previous day's battle, the fatigue lingering in her muscles. Yet, she felt a surge of determination. Her alliance with Robb Stark had always been more than convenience, more than a marriage arranged for politics alone. They were partners in this war, forging a bond that might shape the fate of the entire continent. She would not let him face the mountain's fury without her. Ice and fire side by side. Riverrun's courtyard bustled with activity as Daenerys prepared to depart. Horses stamped and snorted, the Dothraki saddling them with practiced ease. Unsullied formed neat ranks, ready for a forced march southward. Edmure Tully approached, leaning on a cane for support, an injury from a stray arrow he'd taken weeks prior. "You're leaving so soon," Edmure said, voice tinged with both gratitude and anxiety. "The realm barely knows you've liberated Riverrun." Daenerys offered a small, tight smile. "I fear the realm won't have time to celebrate if we don't finish what we started. We must keep pressing the Lannisters. Robb Stark needs our help to break them decisively." Edmure nodded, glancing at the battered men in the courtyard. "Then go with my blessing and my thanks. If not for you, Riverrun would have fallen. I'll do my best to protect the castle and see that your forces here recover." He hesitated. "Send word if you need any Tully banners. It might take time to gather them again, but the Riverlands owe you a debt." "I'll remember," Daenerys promised. "For now, keep your gates closed to any sign of Lannister or Frey. Rebuild your defenses. I suspect we'll need a united front soon enough." They parted, Edmure lingering to wave as Daenerys strode across the slippery cobblestones. Rhaegal awaited her near the outer gate, wings half spread. She could feel the tension in the air. After one day of rest, they were returning to war. The Dothraki, for all their love of battle, seemed subdued, as if they sensed a final confrontation approaching. The Unsullied, disciplined as ever, betrayed no emotion. Daenerys climbed onto Rhaegal's saddle. Ser Jorah was already mounted on a sturdy courser below, nodding respectfully. Missandei rode with a small escort, though she looked less than comfortable on horseback. The plan was simple. Daenerys would fly ahead, scout the battlefield, and coordinate with Robb via sky advantage. The cavalry and infantry would follow as swiftly as possible. She urged Rhaegal aloft. The dragon launched himself over Riverrun's walls, the wind screaming past. Below, the Tully soldiers cheered, the noise rolling like thunder across the ramparts. Daenerys angled south and west, scanning the horizon for plumes of smoke or signals of battle. Cloud cover drifted overhead, and the land below unfurled in a patchwork of forests, meadows, and winding rivers. Within an hour of flight, she spotted the first signs. Black smudges of smoke rising in the far distance, wavering in the cool morning air. She spurred Regal onward, heart pounding. The closer she drew, the more evidence she saw of a raging conflict. The ground below was scorched in places, as if some had tried to set fire to the fields. Bodies dotted the roads, motionless lumps of armor and cloth. Crows scattered in shrieking flocks. Finally, she glimpsed a large host arrayed near the Red Fork, two armies clashing on the rolling plains. The banners of the north were clear, direwolf sigils visible even at a distance. Across from them flew the golden lion of House Lannister. Though the lines were ragged, men spread in a wide arc. She could pick out the swirl of cavalry engagements, dust clouds kicked up by charging knights, and the glint of metal as pikes rose and fell. Her breath hitched. She had never seen such a massive confrontation since she had left Essos. Thousands of men fought across a wide front, the Red Fork's waters running crimson with spilled blood. The crash of steel reached her even in the sky, distant but unmistakable. Among the northern ranks, she spotted a large gray direwolf bounding. Gray Wind, and near him, the distinctive figure of Robb Stark, sword lifted, rallying his men. She guided Regal into a descent, circling to gauge the battlefield. A cluster of knights bearing the Lannister sigil broke away, galloping north in a flanking maneuver. From her vantage, it was clear that if they succeeded, they would crash into the side of Robb's lines, potentially rolling them up. She clenched her jaw, spurring Regal on. She could not let that happen. "Dracarys!" she shouted, as soon as she was within range. The dragon's fire lanced down, a scorching column that intercepted the knights mid-gallop. Horses screamed. Men tumbled in fiery agony. The formation disintegrated, some turning to flee, others lost to the flames. Daenerys banked Regal around, scanning for more such threats. She spotted a second group pulling wagons behind them, possibly an attempt at a barricade or some hidden ordnance. Again, she ordered the fire, and again, the dragon's breath consumed them. Below, a roar went up among the Northmen, a sudden surge of morale at seeing their queen's arrival. Daenerys spotted the Karstark banners pushing forward, while the great Jon Umber's men slammed into the Lannister center. The tide seemed to be turning in the North's favor, but from the corner of her eye, Daenerys saw a massive shape on the battlefield, a knight larger than any around him, clad in dark armor. He cleaved through men like a farmer threshing wheat. Gregor Clegane. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, dwarfed only by the rearing warhorse under him. The horse itself was draped in half-burned barding. Blood soaked the field around him. With savage efficiency, he cut down any unfortunate northern soldier who came within reach, his sword an enormous slab of steel. Men parted before him, so terrifying was his strength. Daenerys felt a pang of revulsion and fear. This was the Mountain, the butcher who had tormented the Riverlands, the man rumored to have defiled and killed Elia Martell and her children, the man who carried out the Lannisters' cruelties without hesitation. She angled Regal toward him, flames building in the dragon's throat. But the Mountain spotted her approach, perhaps hearing the roar overhead, or maybe glimpsing the shape of the dragon's shadow. He spurred his horse with brutal kicks, galloping away through the press of men, weaving behind a line of Lannister pikemen who bristled their weapons upward, ready to impale Regal should he dive too low. Daenerys cursed under her breath, unwilling to risk the dragon at such a close, narrow angle. One well-placed pike could do terrible damage to the membrane of his wings. Instead, she soared back upward, scanning for Robb. She found him to the left flank, locked in combat with a cluster of lion-helmed knights. Gray Wind leapt among them, a deadly gray shadow. Daenerys felt her heart clench as she realized how precarious his position was. The North's left flank had advanced deep, risking encirclement. The Lannisters recognized Robb, and they threw men at him in a desperate attempt to kill the king in the north. Her first instinct was to drench the knights in dragonfire, but Robb and many of his men were entangled in close combat. She couldn't risk burning them as well. Instead, she circled overhead, waiting for an opening. At last, she saw a patch of open ground behind the Lannister ranks. She signaled Regal to land there, and the dragon crashed down with an earth-shaking impact, scattering knights who spun around in terror. Daenerys leapt off the saddle, stumbling slightly as she drew a short sword from her belt. Rhaegal let out a deafening roar, steam blowing from his jaws as he snapped at the nearest foe. The Lannister knights faltered, some turning to face the new threat. Grey Wind seized that moment of distraction to leap upon a knight's back, rending him to the ground. Robb, battered and bloodied but fighting on, slashed another soldier across the throat. Before the man even fell, Robb's gaze darted to Daenerys, relief and alarm playing across his features. "Dany!" he shouted over the din, voice raw with exertion. "Get clear!" But she was already in motion, parrying a wild swing from a panicked Lannister footman. The clang rattled her bones, but she held. Rhaegal blasted a spout of flame sideways, missing Grey Wind by mere feet and engulfing two knights in a shrieking inferno. The stench of burned flesh filled the air. Daenerys fought down her revulsion and drove her blade into the man before her. He fell, knocking her off balance, and she staggered, chest heaving. Robb lunged to her side, dispatching a soldier who aimed a spear at her back. For a heartbeat, they stood side by side, panting. Blood streaked his face, sweat matted his hair. Yet, in his eyes shone fierce pride. "You shouldn't be on foot," he breathed. "But I'm glad you're here." She gave a short nod, not trusting herself to speak in that moment. Another wave of Lannister reinforcements surged, and the two of them fought back to back, Daenerys' short sword flashing, Robb's steel singing. Grey Wind circled them, snarling, driving foes away with the direwolf's sheer ferocity. Rhaegal loomed behind, a living fortress of scale and fire. Gradually, the press of Lannisters receded. Many were dead or wounded, and the survivors were giving ground. Bolstered by the arrival of Dothraki outriders and the vanguard of Unsullied, who had finally caught up to her, the Northmen reformed ranks, pushing the lion banners back across the plain. Horns sounded from the Lannister side, signaling retreat. What had been a vicious, close-fought melee devolved into a rout. Soldiers broke rank and ran, dropping shields and weapons as they fled. Still, Gregor Clegane was not among the fleeing men. Daenerys scanned the battlefield, trying to spot him again. The mountain, it seemed, had vanished. She worried that meant he was preparing some brutal counterstroke. But the tempo of battle shifted too quickly. Northmen poured forward, howling victory, chasing down pockets of resistance. White banners of surrender appeared, and the ground was thick with the dead. If the mountain had any cunning, perhaps he recognized a lost battle and simply retreated to fight another day. She felt both relief and unease at that prospect. Robb sagged against the remains of a broken cart, trying to catch his breath. Blood dripped from a gash in his left arm, and his cloak was slashed in multiple places. Grey Wind nuzzled him, whining softly. Daenerys approached, face grim, and placed her hand gently on his wounded arm. "You're hurt," she said. He offered a tired half-smile. "So are you." His gaze flicked to the cut on her cheek. "But we're alive, and it looks like we've won another day." One of Robb's bannermen, Lord Karstark's son Harrenhal, hurried over, saluting awkwardly. "Your Grace, your Graces," he panted, eyes wide with equal parts relief and exhaustion. "The Lannisters are in full retreat. Our scouts say Gregor Clegane has abandoned the field, heading west. We've got 1,000 prisoners, maybe more." Daenerys and Robb exchanged a look. Victory, for the moment, but the cost was visible in the moans of the dying, the keening of survivors who found the bodies of friends. Robb glanced around, jaw tight. "See to the wounded, ours and theirs," he told Harrenhal. "Signal that there will be mercy for those who lay down arms." As Harrenhal rushed off, Robb turned fully to Daenerys, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "You arrived just in time. Another hour, and we might have been overwhelmed in the flank." "Thank you, my queen." She inclined her head. "We do this together, remember? I only wish we could have ended Gregor Clegane here and now." Robb's gaze hardened, recalling the monstrous figure. "He'll answer for his crimes one day soon." For now, the Lannisters have lost a major force. This is their second crushing defeat in as many days. News of Riverrun's liberation will have reached them by now, too. Daenerys nodded, allowing herself a faint smile. Cersei will not be pleased. No, Robb agreed, wearily wiping sweat from his brow. But we can't stand still. We have to press this advantage, or at least secure the Riverlands and the Neck. The Lannisters may try again, or they may fortify the roads to Harrenhal. In any case, we'll need rest, supplies, and a plan. And we must not forget the Iron Islands. Euron Greyjoy might raid the western shores if he sees an opening. She let out a soft sigh. You speak as if we have 1,000 tasks, each urgent, each impossible to ignore. I suppose we do. That's the weight of command, he murmured, reaching out to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. His fingers left a smear of blood on her cheek, but she did not flinch. We've made great strides, Daenerys. The realm is beginning to heed us. If we can keep winning, we might unite enough lords to end this war. At that moment, the sun broke through the clouds, shining pale gold across the battlefield. The Northmen raised their banners, their voices rolling across the plain in a cheer for their living king and queen. The Dothraki hooped in victory, brandishing rocks, while the Unsullied stood silent but proud. Blood stained the grass, and the dead lay thick, but a sense of deliverance trembled in the air. Daenerys turned her gaze from the devastation to Robb's resolute face. They had faced dragonfire, steel, and unimaginable cruelty to reach this point. In that fleeting moment, the bond between them, one forged in sorrow, war, and necessity, felt stronger than ever. She could see in his eyes the same determination that burned in hers. Ice and fire, she thought. Together, they could do what neither could accomplish alone. She only prayed that it would be enough before winter's true horrors marched south from beyond the wall. But for now, as the clang of swords faded and the crows descended to feast, they had carried the day. They had broken the Lannister siege at Riverrun, shattered the Mountains' offensive in the field, and claimed another foothold for their alliance. The realm trembled with the knowledge. The king in the north and the mother of dragons were no passing fancy, no frail attempt at union. They were a force that might shape the destiny of Westeros for generations to come. That evening, they set camp near the battlefield, building pyres for the dead. The smell of burning flesh and wood clung to the night air. Daenerys walked among the tents with Robb, checking on the wounded. The soldiers who recognized her bowed with awe or murmured blessings under their breath. Some called her the Dragon Queen, others whispered a new title, the Storm of the North. She offered them what comfort she could. Robb, too, wore the mantle of command heavily, stopping at each tent where a Northman or ally lay in pain. He spoke words of encouragement, praised their bravery. When he saw how many had fallen, sorrow lined his features. War was not new to him, but the cost never grew easier to bear. They found a moment of privacy in the largest command tent, where a single brazier glowed. Gray wind lay curled in the corner, exhausted from the day's carnage. An old table had been cleared of maps to make room for bread, salt, and a flagon of wine. Missandei and a few scribes worked in an adjoining space sorting reports. Outside, the voices of men drifted, subdued but occasionally flaring in a brief triumphal cheer. Daenerys eased onto a makeshift bench, muscles aching. Robb poured 2 cups of wine and joined her. They sipped in silence, the tension of the day slowly receding. "How bad is your arm?" he asked eventually, eyeing her bandage. She shrugged, wincing slightly. "The maester at Riverrun cleaned it. It's nothing serious. And your wounds?" He flexed the arm that had been gashed, grimacing. "Nothing a few stitches can't fix. I'll be all right." A hush enveloped them. The brazier crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the tent walls. Finally, Robb set his cup aside and laced his fingers with hers. She felt the roughness of calluses, the lingering tremor of exhaustion. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "You saved countless lives today, including mine." She shook her head. "We saved each other. I couldn't stand to see you overrun." His gaze flicked away, then back. I know this marriage was formed out of necessity, but in these battles, I've seen your resolve, your care for my people, your courage. You are more than a queen to me, Daenerys. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I want you to know that. Her heart stuttered. She had once been sold to Khal Drogo, forging an uneasy alliance that later became a bond of genuine affection. Now, here in Westeros, she had wed a man whose path was as steeped in war as hers. Over time, a quiet understanding had formed between them, grown through shared trials. Perhaps something more than duty or convenience had begun to blossom in the spaces between sword strokes and royal edicts. She squeezed his hand gently. I feel the same. She let out a soft breath, glancing at the brazier's coals. All my life, I've fought to be recognized, to reclaim my birthright, to free people from cruelty. Most alliances have been fragile, undone by betrayal. But you stand firm no matter the storm or the fire. I see the heart in you, and Her voice caught briefly. I respect it. I admire it. A tentative smile curved his lips, and he lifted her hand, pressing it to his chest. We'll have more battles to fight, more losses to endure. But if we stand as one, perhaps we'll see a day when the realm is united, and not just in words. A day when we can focus on the greatest threat of all, the darkness beyond the wall. She reached up and traced the bruise forming along his jaw. We must. Otherwise, all these victories will be ashes when the dead come. He nodded, solemn. Then he leaned forward, and she closed the distance, their lips meeting. The weight of war and sorrow hovered around them, but for that moment, in the hush of the tent, they found a rare solace in each other. The kiss was gentle at first, an acknowledgement of survival and gratitude. Then it deepened, urgency and relief mingling with the taste of salt on their tongues. They broke apart, breathing unevenly, foreheads touching. Outside, the camp stirred, oblivious to the flicker of intimacy within the command tent. Here, two battered souls, drawn together by duty but bound now by something far deeper, found a brief respite from the bleakness that shadowed them. Stay with me, he murmured. Just for tonight. Let the war be a distant echo. She gave the slightest nod, fingers still knotted in his tunic. Words felt unnecessary. They were both survivors, both grieving what had been lost, both clinging to hope for what might still be saved. In the morning, they would rise again to lead armies, to make decisions that shaped the fate of kingdoms. For now, in the dim warmth of the tent, they allowed themselves to be simply Robb and Daenerys, the man and the woman behind the crowns. A thin, pale dawn broke over the battlefield, revealing the aftermath of the prior day's carnage. Bodies still lay scattered in the trampled mud, crows picking at scraps of flesh. Men moved among the fallen, carefully separating friend from foe, gathering the dead for pyres or burials. The stench of death hung heavy in the cold air. Yet the survivors took heart. Campfires glowed amid the wreckage, and the victorious armies of the North and their allies found a grim camaraderie in having faced the Lannisters and triumphed. Prisoners were corralled under guard, some surrendered knights waiting to see if mercy would truly be granted. The stories of Dragonfire and direwolves spread in hushed, awed tones. At the center of it all, Robb Stark and Daenerys Targaryen emerged from the command tent, arm in arm. Their expressions were solemn, their eyes still reflecting the horrors of battle. But in the set of their shoulders, there was resolve, the knowledge that they had struck another heavy blow against the greatest threat to their cause, at least among mortal kings. They conferred briefly with their captains, organizing supply lines for the wounded and ensuring the dead would be honored as best they could in a war zone. Some of the more recalcitrant Lannister men might be ransomed if they were of noble birth. Others would face the choice of service or continued imprisonment. Daenerys insisted that no cruelty be visited upon them, for she had not fought to replace one tyranny with another. Robb agreed, mindful that the realm watched their every move. When the immediate matters were settled, they gathered in a semi-collapsed barn that served as a makeshift war council chamber. Lords Bolton, Karstark, Manderly, and Umber huddled around, joined by Ser Jorah and a handful of Dothraki representatives. Maps were spread over crates weighted down with stones. Candles flickered in the drafts that seeped through the gaps in the barn walls. "The Lannisters have lost heavily," Lord Bolton said, his voice quiet but carrying. "Many of their men are dead, many more captured. Gregor Clegane escaped west, likely heading for Lannisport or perhaps Harrenhal. We can't be certain." "Good riddance," growled Lord Umber. Fists nodded. "But he'll cause trouble if left alive." Robb nodded. "He will. But for now, they're on the back foot. Riverrun is liberated, and the riverlands can rally around House Tully. This might be our chance to press south, to break the Lannisters once and for all." Daenerys studied the maps, remembering her vow not to let the Iron Throne distract them from the larger threat. Yet, unseating the Lannisters was a necessary step if they were to unify the realm. "We should consider how far south we're prepared to go," she said. "If we stretch ourselves too thin, the Iron Islands might raid the west coast, or the Vale might remain aloof, and we still have to keep watch for any sign of the dead marching south." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Few in Westeros truly believed the stories of White Walkers, but none dared gainsay the Queen in her own council, particularly not with Robb Stark at her side, who trusted Jon Snow's word implicitly. Lord Karstark cleared his throat. "If we're to approach King's Landing, we'll need the support of the Stormlands or the Reach, or we risk being flanked. The Tyrells hold power in the south. Are they any closer to pledging fealty to you, Your Grace?" Daenerys shook her head. "They've sent cautious ravens, but I have not yet secured a definite alliance. Their loyalty to the Iron Throne has always been pragmatic. We might persuade them, especially if they sense that Cersei Lannister's cause is lost." Robb tapped a finger on the map near the trident. "We could send envoys, present them with an opportunity to side with us before we march further. If the Tyrells see that we can defeat the Lannisters without them, they may not want to miss the chance to be on the winning side." Lord Bolton inclined his head in agreement. "And Dorne?" Daenerys took a breath. "The Martells have reason to hate the Lannisters. They might be sympathetic, especially given the murder of Elia Martell by Gregor Clegane. But Dorne is cautious and proud. My letters to Prince Doran have received only polite acknowledgments so far." Robb frowned. "We'll see if another victory changes their mind. For now, we regroup in the Riverlands. We gather men, supplies, and let the realm know that the North and House Targaryen stand united. Once we're ready, we decide if we move on the capital." The lords around the table nodded gravely. The next phase of the war would be the most critical. They could not simply fight endless battles with no endgame. The goal was to break the Lannisters, remove the usurpers from King's Landing, and seat Daenerys Targaryen, and by marriage the Stark family, at the heart of power. Only then could they have any hope of unifying against the invasion of the White Walkers. As the meeting concluded, Daenerys caught Robb's eye. She recognized the exhaustion etched in his features, the pain from his wounds and tea, the unspoken longing for home. He had been so young when the War of the Five Kings began, thrust into a mantle of leadership he'd never sought. She yearned to bring him peace, just as she yearned to bring peace to the realm. They stepped outside together, into the misty daylight. The battlefield had quieted to a grim hush. Pyres burned in the distance, sending up plumes of ashen smoke. Despite the sorrow and ruin, a sense of possibility lingered. The king in the north and the Dragon Queen had triumphed twice over the Lannisters, forging a legend that spread among the survivors like sparks in tinder. Robb paused near a battered tree stump, gazing at the horizon. "We'll march to Riverrun, consolidate our forces. I'll need to speak to my uncle Edmure, ensure the Riverlands are truly committed. Then perhaps we can move on Harrenhal. If Gregor Clegane is fool enough to hole up there, we'll root him out." Daenerys rested a hand on his uninjured arm. "We should also consider some rest for our men. They're half-starved and weary. Your people have been fighting a long time." He gave a grim laugh. "Aye, you're right, but rest never seems to last in Westeros. We'll do what we can." A hush stretched between them. Then gently he brushed her bandaged cheek. "You saved me yesterday. I don't think I'll ever forget the sight of you on Regal, descending into the thick of Lannister knights. She felt heat rise to her face. I had no choice. You were... She cleared her throat, letting her tone convey what words did not. I won't lose you. A rare, tender smile flickered across his lips. Nor I you. They stood there in fragile serenity, the war momentarily held at bay. Beyond them, the men dismantled battered siege engines, collected salvageable armor, and prepared for the next move. The smoke from funeral pyres curled into the sky, a reminder of all they had lost. Yet, in the quiet devotion shining in their eyes, they found a semblance of hope. Over the following weeks, events moved swiftly. Riders galloped through the riverlands, announcing the fall of the Lannister siege at Riverrun and the defeat of Gregor Clegane's host. Small folk who had once cowered in terror took heart, offering tokens of thanks. Fresh bread, salted fish, dried fruits, to the marching armies of the North and the Targaryens. Some riverlords who had remained hidden or cautious emerged to pledge their allegiance to Daenerys and Robb, including House Mallister, House Bracken, and House Blackwood. Others, less convinced, sent cautious messages of support while keeping their forces in reserve. At Riverrun, the banners of House Tully once again flew proudly. Edmure worked tirelessly with his staff and Maester Vyman to fortify the castle and restore order in the ravaged countryside. Daenerys spent time there, meeting local lords, easing tensions, and distributing what supplies she could spare. Robb coordinated from a nearby war camp, drilling his men and conferring with lords who trickled in to join their cause. The North's presence in the Riverlands grew, and with it, the legend of the king and queen whose combined might had repelled 2 Lannister armies in swift succession. Rumors filled the air like dandelion seeds. Some claimed Daenerys' dragons were unstoppable, that King's Landing would burn by the next moon's turn. Others whispered that the Targaryen queen and the Stark king possessed some mystical bond, ice and fire. Many believed their child, should one be born, would unite the entire realm under a single banner. None of these rumors were entirely true, but they spread hope and fear in equal measure. Letters also arrived from other corners of Westeros. The Vale, under Peter Baelish's influence, offered polite words but no concrete commitment. Dorne responded with more subtlety, Prince Doran Martell penning a measured missive that expressed sympathy for the Targaryen cause while making no firm promises. The Reach remained quiet, though a few lesser Tyrell bannermen sent cautious queries. Cersei Lannister, presumably still in King's Landing, was silent. If she raged, it was behind closed doors. Euron Greyjoy's letters, scrawled in bizarre, mocking tones, arrived sporadically, boasting of storms and twisted schemes. In these uncertain days, Daenerys and Robb found themselves drawn closer. They held evening councils in Riverrun Solar, sometimes alone, sometimes with trusted advisors. They spoke of war, of the White Walkers, of the future they tried to shape. And in the stillness of late nights, behind closed doors, they allowed the weight of their burdens to dissolve in each other's arms. In those moments, they were neither conquerors nor rulers, but 2 young souls seeking solace in a world that demanded everything of them. As the nights lengthened, so did the shadows of rumor about the undead in the far north. Jon Snow's ravens to Robb spoke of ominous movements beyond the wall, sightings of wights, strange storms, and free folk who had vanished without a trace. Word came that the wildlings who had joined the Night's Watch were on high alert, fortifying Eastwatch by the sea. Some in the Riverlands scoffed at the notion of ice demons. Others whispered that winter was indeed coming. Daenerys, recalling her meeting atop the wall, felt a chill run down her spine. She could not ignore the call for unity against such a foe. But first, the Lannisters had to be defeated, or else the realm would never rally in time. At last, after many days of reorganizing and mustering new levies, the time came to decide the next strategic move. In Riverrun's Great Hall, Daenerys and Robb convened a final war council before setting out. Lords Tully, Karstark, Manderly, Umber, Bolton, as well as Ser Jorah, Missandei, and several other northern and Riverland knights assembled around a long table. The painted map of Westeros lay before them, weighed down by goblets. Candle flames danced across the ancient walls, illuminating stern faces. Robb traced a line with his finger. Gregor Clegane was last seen heading west, possibly toward Harrenhal or the Gold Road. If he tries to regroup with another Lannister force, it'll be somewhere near the Blackwater or at Harrenhal itself. We can't let them rebuild their strength. Daenerys nodded. Harrenhal is a cursed place, but it remains a strategic fortress. If the Lannisters hold it, they control the crossroads of the Trident and could threaten our lines. We must either secure it or ensure it cannot be used against us. Lord Bolton inclined his head. My scouts suggest Harrenhal is lightly held by a Lannister garrison. It wouldn't withstand a large assault, especially if a dragon is brought to bear. But you must be wary of traps. The mountain is known for cruelty, not subtlety. Yet that doesn't mean the Lannisters won't lay ambushes. And if Harrenhal falls, Lord Karstark added, the path to King's Landing is clear. The Crownlands would stand exposed. Silence weighed on the gathered lords. Everyone understood the implications. Taking Harrenhal would be the next great step toward dethroning Cersei Lannister and securing the Targaryen claim. But each step south meant more men lost, more resources spent. And each day spent warring here was another day the northern threat grew stronger beyond the wall. Robb looked to Daenerys. In that glance, she felt his concern, his urgency. She laid both hands on the table. We press on Harrenhal. We break any Lannister hold there and secure it as a forward base. Then we send envoys again to the Tyrells and Dorne, offering them a chance to join us before we march on King's Landing. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Lord Umber struck the tabletop with a thick fist. Aye, let's tear that cursed ruin from their clutches. So it was decided. The armies would march at week's end, giving them time to finish repairs on weapons, to bury the Riverlanders who had perished, and to stock provisions. Daenerys would lead Regal from the air, coordinating with cavalry movements. Robb would take command of the main host. They would approach Harrenhal from multiple angles, ensuring that the Lannisters, if they still held it, would face a quick, devastating siege. The meeting broke, men departing in small knots, discussing details of supply and deployment. Daenerys lingered by the table, studying the map. She traced the route from Riverrun to Harrenhal, then onward toward King's Landing. How long, she wondered, before she stood at the gates of the capital? How many more battles must be fought? Robb came up beside her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. We're close, he said softly. A year ago, I was losing ground, betrayed at the Twins, half my bannermen scattering. Now, with you at my side, we've turned the tide. She glanced at his face, etched with faint lines of worry and fatigue. I'm glad, she whispered, but I fear what it will cost us if the dead truly march while we're locked in these battles. His gaze darkened. I know. Once the Lannisters are dealt with, we'll have to rally the entire realm north. Jon sent a raven, saying the free folk speak of an army of the dead. They sense it, like wolves smelling a distant storm. But if we reach the Iron Throne first, we'll have the power to command every lord to unite. That might be our only hope. Daenerys shut her eyes briefly, a memory surfacing of the cold wind atop the wall. Then let's see Harrenhal taken. And from there, we force Cersei to bend, or break. The morning of departure arrived in a swirl of horns and activity. Banners were unfurled, wagons loaded, and thousands of men formed ranks outside Riverrun. The castle gates opened wide to let the columns pass. Edmure Tully and his wife Rosalind stood at the gates, bidding farewell. They would remain behind to continue fortifying the region in the Alliance's name. Daenerys led the first wave, Regal gliding overhead in lazy circles. She wore a fitted leather cuirass over her traveling garments, a compromise between comfort and protection. At her side rode Ser Jorah, Missandei, and a guard of Unsullied on horseback, an unusual sight, given their typical role as foot soldiers. Further back marched the main body of the army, Robb at the head with Grey Wind prowling. Lords Karstark, Bolton, and the Great Jon guided their respective bannermen. The Dothraki rode in flanking formations, excited to move again after weeks of relative idleness. The journey to Harrenhal would take several days. The roads were choked with refugees and travelers, many fleeing the riverlands to find safer ground. The Alliance let them pass in peace, offering what small comfort they could. Daenerys' heart clenched at the sight of hollow-eyed children and mothers carrying meager belongings. War left its mark on the innocent most of all. As they advanced, Rhaegal soared ahead, sometimes vanishing beyond the horizon to scout. Daenerys would land occasionally, checking in with Robb and the scouts to ensure they maintained a cohesive formation. They encountered scattered Lannister raiders, easily swept aside. At each skirmish, the news spread. The Targaryen queen and the king in the north marched in force. More than once, Daenerys noticed Lannister soldiers simply throwing down arms rather than facing dragonfire. A strange hush fell over the land as they drew closer to Harrenhal. The ruined silhouette appeared on the horizon one dusk, its massive, melted towers looming like broken teeth against a violet sky. Smoke rose from within the fortress walls, indicating occupancy. No doubt a Lannister garrison, or at least mercenaries loyal to them, held the castle. The approach to Harrenhal was fraught with pitfalls, boggy marshes, hidden ditches, thick forests that could hide ambushers. But the scouts reported only minimal resistance, as though the defenders had neither the numbers nor the will to mount an aggressive defense. Under cover of darkness, the Alliance's leaders gathered in a final briefing. They stood in the shadow of an ancient oak, torches flickering around them, the battered shape of Harrenhal just visible beyond a low ridge. The fortress loomed, even in near ruin, an enduring testament to Aegon's conquest and the doom that dragonfire could visit upon mortal stone. "We'll surround them from 3 sides," Robb said, using a small stick to draw lines in the dirt. "The main force will approach the western gate, the Dothraki will circle to the east, and Daenerys will hold the skies with Rhaegal. Once we breach the gate, it shouldn't take long to rout whoever's inside." Lord Bolton nodded, expression neutral. "If the garrison sees a dragon overhead, they may surrender without a fight." Daenerys listened, recalling tales of Harrenhal's curses, how each house that took it eventually met ruin. She suppressed a shiver, focusing on the practical. "If they surrender quickly, we spare bloodshed. But remain vigilant for traps. Gregor Clegane may be inside, or he may not. In any case, we proceed carefully." At dawn, they advanced. Drummers beat a steady cadence, horns signaling the approach. Harrenhal's great walls loomed larger, scarred black where Balerion the Black Dread had once unleashed Aegon's wrath. Now another Targaryen dragon soared overhead, a living echo of that ancient conquest. Daenerys flew Rhaegal in wide arcs, scanning for signs of archers or scorpions on the parapets. She saw only a few figures scrambling along the ramparts, no large siege engines. Below, Robb's columns reached the main gate. Atop the ramparts, a Lannister captain shouted something unintelligible, then hoisted a white cloth on a broken lance. Daenerys felt a jolt of surprise. Were they surrendering outright? She had Rhaegal descend, landing in a blasted courtyard just inside the main gate after Robb's men had opened it cautiously. The interior of Harrenhal was as grim as legend described. Massive halls with collapsed roofs, spires melted by dragonfire centuries ago, courtyards littered with debris. A small force of Lannister men stood with hands raised, their captain trembling before the advancing Northmen. No sign of Gregor Clegane or any formidable figure. Robb rode in at the head of his men, Grey Wind striding by his horse. Daenerys dismounted from Rhaegal, drawing stares of terror and awe from the Lannister defenders, who knelt or cowered. The courtyard fell quiet, the only sound the crackle of distant fires in empty hearths. "You surrender?" Robb demanded, voice echoing in the vast yard. The Lannister captain, gaunt and clearly frightened, bowed. "Aye, my lord, my king. We've no quarrel with you. Gregor Clegane left weeks ago, took the best of the men. We've only a token garrison here. Food's near gone, no reinforcements. We'd rather live than die for a lost cause." Robb's jaw flexed. He glanced at Daenerys, who lifted her chin. "Then lay down your arms," she said, voice carrying. "We will accept your surrender. Any who wish to join our cause must swear fealty. The rest will remain under guard." The men obeyed, tossing swords and spears on the ground. Daenerys looked around, marveling at how swiftly Harrenhal had fallen. For all its curses and might, the fortress was an empty husk, symbolic of the Lannisters' diminishing power in this region. She wondered if Gregor Clegane, or even Jaime Lannister, might have intended to hold this ground but found themselves spread too thin. Lord Bolton led a detachment to search the fortress, reporting back that it was largely deserted, with only a handful of servants and stable hands lurking in fear. The place reeked of neglect and the echoes of cruelty, for the Lannisters had used Harrenhal as a seat of terror during the war, interrogating Riverlanders and housing prisoners in the dungeon. Daenerys felt a grim satisfaction that now, at least, this monstrous castle would serve them, and perhaps be less monstrous for it. By midday, the northern banners flew over Harrenhal, joined by the Targaryen sigil. The fortress was secured. In a single day, they had claimed one of the greatest strongholds in Westeros. The realm would take note. The king in the north and his dragon queen now stood but leagues away from the Crownlands, an imposing threat to Cersei's hold on the Iron Throne. Daenerys stood on the highest accessible parapet, looking toward King's Landing. Though it was too far to see the city, she felt its pull. Aegon the Conqueror had once brought his dragons from Harrenhal to the gates of the capital, and now she might do the same. But that choice loomed vast and perilous. Would the city open its gates or burn beneath dragonfire? Could she claim the throne without becoming the very tyrant she despised? The questions weighed on her. Robb joined her, the wind ruffling his cloak. He rested a hand on the warm stone battlement. "Harrenhal is ours, easily taken. Almost too easily." She nodded, her silver-gold hair trailing in the breeze. Cersei's hold on the Crownlands must be tenuous if she cannot spare men to defend this place. Perhaps she's gathered her forces closer to King's Landing, anticipating our arrival. He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Then the next step is clear. We call on the realm again. Tyrells, Martells, any house that might stand with us. If they join, we march on the capital. If not..." He trailed off, but the meaning was plain. War would come to King's Landing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, gazing into the distance. "We'll see if Westeros can be saved from itself before winter's darkness claims us all." They stood there, side by side, high above the cursed halls of Harrenhal, rulers who had carved a path of blood and flame across the war-torn fields of the Riverlands. Beyond them lay the final stretch of this mortal struggle, a city of 1,000,000 souls, perched on the edge of the continent, a throne of swords and secrets. The king in the north and the mother of dragons had come far, and they would go farther still, bound together by vows and convictions stronger than steel. In the courtyard below, Regal stirred, letting out a low rumble that vibrated through the ancient stones. Soldiers bustled, lugging supplies, clearing rubble, raising their banners in the gloom. And upon the ramparts, Daenerys and Robb exchanged a final, resolute glance. Their destiny was at hand, ice and fire, poised to challenge the Lion Queen in her den of intrigues. No matter the cost, they would see this war through to its end, and perhaps, if the gods willed it, guide Westeros to a dawn beyond the night that threatened to consume it. They shared one last quiet moment, gazing at each other, minds filled with unspoken hopes and fears. Then, with the wind carrying the faint echo of crows circling overhead, they turned and descended from the parapet, ready to shape the next chapter of their entwined fates. The future of the Seven Kingdoms awaited them, as did the ghosts of its past. If Harrenhal's ruined towers could speak, they might have whispered caution. But ice and fire pressed on, determined to forge a realm redeemed before the true darkness fell.